Have you ever felt true, unfiltered silence? I don't mean the quiet of a suburban street after midnight, where you can still hear the distant hum of a freeway or the buzz of a refrigerator. I don't mean the manufactured peace of a soundproofed room. I mean a silence that is so profound, so absolute, that it ceases to be an absence of sound and becomes a presence in itself. It's a physical weight, a pressure that builds in your ears and settles deep in your chest. It's the kind of silence that makes you acutely aware of the sound of your own blood pulsing, the soft whisper of your own breath. This is the silence of the deep wilderness, the kind you can only earn by walking for days, leaving every trace of the human world behind until you are nothing more than a temporary guest in a kingdom that is ancient, vast, and utterly indifferent to your existence. I used to seek it out, craved it. My name is Arthur Kendricks, and for the better part of 2 decades, my life has been defined by my relationship with those silent, untamed places. I'm what you might call a solo wilderness explorer, though that title feels a bit too grandiose for what I actually do. In truth, I'm just a man who feels more at home with a compass in his hand and 50 pounds of gear on his back than he does in a crowded city. I've charted unnamed peaks in the Sawtooths, navigated the dense, humid labyrinth of the Olympic rainforest, and felt the biting, unforgiving wind of the Arctic tundra on the few exposed inches of my face. The wild was my church, solitude was my prayer, and a worn-out topographical map was my scripture. I'm telling you all this not to boast of my adventures. I'm telling you this to establish a baseline, to make it clear that I am not a novice. I am not a man prone to flights of fancy or easily spooked by a snapping twig in the night. I am rational. I am methodical. I believe in cause and effect, in the laws of physics, and in the observable, explainable patterns of the natural world. Which is why what I'm about to tell you is so difficult. It's a story that defies every principle I have built my life upon. It's a violation of the natural order. I'm not here today to talk about the breathtaking beauty of the untamed world. I'm here to share a warning. A protocol, if you will, for something you can't prepare for with a first aid kit or a satellite phone. Something that breaks the rules of nature, the rules of physics, and ultimately the rules of your own sanity. I'm here to tell you what happened when I found a place where those rules don't apply. I'm here to tell you about a river that flows the wrong way, and about the thing that followed me back from its banks. A thing that wears my face. So, I invite you to do what I can no longer do. Find a quiet place. Dim the lights. Allow yourself to sink into the silence. And listen, because what I'm about to tell you, it didn't just happen to me. In a way, it's still happening right now in every reflective surface in this room. The story begins, as so many of my most profound journeys do, with a map. Not a modern, satellite-imaged, GPS-synced file on a screen, but a real map, an old, brittle, beautiful survey map from the late 19th century. Collect them. It's a quiet passion of mine. These maps are more than just geographical records. They are artifacts of human ambition and fear. They hold secrets, forgotten names, and the faint, ghostly lines of trails long since reclaimed by the earth. I was in a dusty antique shop in Port Townsend, Washington. It was the kind of place that smells of old paper, cedar, and the damp sea air that permeates everything in that town. I was sifting through a large wooden crate filled with miscellaneous documents, old deeds, maritime charts, logging company ledgers, when my fingers brushed against it. It was a topographical survey, rolled and tied with a faded ribbon. The paper was thick, linen-based, and had yellowed to the color of old ivory. It depicted a vast, unnamed wilderness area deep in the Olympic Peninsula, a tangled knot of jagged peaks and deep, forest-choked valleys that even modern cartographers seem to have largely ignored. It was a blank spot on the map, a cartographer's nightmare and an explorer's dream. I unrolled it carefully on the dusty countertop, the old paper crackling in protest. The detail was exquisite, the work of a skilled and patient hand. Contour lines, elevation markers, notations about timber quality and geological formations. It was a professional piece of work. But it was a tiny, almost imperceptible annotation in the margin that made the breath catch in my throat. Next to a faint blue line that snaked through the deepest, most inaccessible part of a valley, a spidery, unsteady hand had written in faded brown ink, "Unwinding river. Flow rebels against the grade. God forgive me." I read it again, and again. Flow rebels against the grade. It was a surveyor's term, an engineer's term. It meant the river flowed against the natural slope of the land. In layman's terms, it meant the river flowed uphill. Now, as I said, I'm a man of logic. My mind immediately began searching for rational explanations. I know about rare geological phenomena like siphons, where water can be pulled against gravity for a short distance. I know about artesian pressure systems. I know about optical illusions created by the surrounding landscape that can trick the eye. I was skeptical, of course. The wilderness is full of curiosities that can seem magical until science explains them. But it was the last 3 words that truly burrowed into my mind. The last 3 words that elevated this from a geological curiosity to something else. God forgive me. That wasn't the note of a surveyor dispassionately documenting an anomaly. That was the terrified confession of a man who had witnessed something that shook him to his core. Something he felt was a transgression, a sin against the natural order. What could a man see in a simple river that would make him beg for divine forgiveness? The shopkeeper, an old man with spectacles perched on the end of his nose, saw my fixation. "Find something interesting?" he asked, his voice raspy. "Who made this map?" I asked, my finger hovering over the inscription. He squinted at it. "Ah, that one. Part of the old McCleary survey expedition. Around 1888, I believe. They were charting the interior for potential timber and mining claims. A tough bunch of men. The official reports from that expedition are dry as dust. But the rumors, the stories the men told when they came back, they were different. They spoke of a valley that was unsettled, a place the local tribes refused to enter. Said the land there was wronged. The challenge was irresistible. The mystery was a hook that sank deep into my soul. A river that flowed the wrong way, hidden deep in a forgotten wilderness, tied to a story of fear and a cryptic plea for forgiveness. It was the kind of legend that explorers like me live for. I bought the map without haggling. I spent the next 2 months in a state of obsessive preparation. This wasn't a casual weekend hike. The area the map depicted was true wilderness. Trackless, treacherous, and known for its sudden, violent weather shifts where a sunny morning could turn into a hypothermic nightmare by noon. My planning was meticulous. I cross-referenced the old survey with modern satellite imagery, trying to plot a viable route. The valley was even more remote than I had imagined, shielded by a series of formidable ridges. I packed for a 3-week solo expedition. This meant carrying everything I needed to survive on my back. My gear was state-of-the-art. A lightweight, four-season tent, a sub-zero sleeping bag, a water purifier, a multi-fuel stove. My food was mostly dehydrated meals, calorie-dense and tasteless. I carried a satellite phone for the direst of emergencies, a personal locator beacon, and my trusted compass. And, of course, I brought my camera. I've always been an amateur photographer. It's my way of trying to capture the soul of a place, to translate the profound feeling of being in the wild into a single static image. I never imagined the images I would bring back from this trip. Finally, the day came. I drove for hours, the paved roads giving way to gravel, the gravel giving way to a muddy, rutted track that was barely passable in my 4x4. I left my truck at a long-abandoned logging trailhead, a small clearing being slowly swallowed by ferns and salal bushes. I shouldered my pack, its familiar weight a comfort. I took one last look at the world of roads and engines, and then I turned and stepped into the green twilight of the old-growth forest. The real journey had begun. The first week of the trek was arduous but, in many ways, familiar. It was the wilderness I knew and loved. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, decaying leaves, and the sharp, clean fragrance of pine and cedar. The only sounds were the crunch of my boots on the forest floor, the distant cry of a hawk circling high overhead, and the occasional rustle in the undergrowth that marked the passing of some unseen creature. The solitude was a balm. Each step, each ridge I crested, took me further from the noise and complication of civilization and deeper into that profound, healing silence. I felt the stresses of modern life slough off me like a heavy coat. I was in my element. I felt strong, capable, and alive. But as I pushed deeper, following the ghost of a route from that 120-year-old map, I began to cross an invisible threshold. The character of the forest began to shift. The change was subtle at first, a collection of small, barely noticeable details. The woods grew unnaturally quiet. It wasn't a gradual fading of sound. It was as if a switch had been flipped. The birdsong that had been my constant companion simply ceased. The chattering of squirrels fell silent. Even the buzzing of insects seemed to have been muted. The silence that I had once craved began to feel different. It was no longer peaceful. It was expectant, heavy. The entire soundscape of the forest had been hollowed out, leaving behind a vacuum that felt watchful. The forest itself seemed older, darker. The trees ancient Douglas firs and Sitka spruce were monolithic giants, their tops lost in the low-hanging clouds. They were draped in thick, suffocating cloaks of gray-green moss that swallowed the light, creating a perpetual state of twilight even at high noon. The air grew still and cold, lacking the normal forest breezes. I made camp on the 8th night by a small, clear stream. As I sat by my small, crackling fire, nursing a hot cup of tea, I had the distinct, prickling sensation of being watched. It's a common feeling for a solo hiker in the wild. Your primal senses kick into high gear. Usually, you can identify the source, the faint snap of a twig, revealing a curious deer. A shadow moving at the edge of your vision that turns out to be a coyote. You make some noise, assert your presence, and the feeling passes. But this was different. It wasn't the alert sense of a predator. It was the cold, patient observation of an intelligence. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. I slowly scanned the impenetrable wall of darkness that encircled my tiny island of firelight, my hand resting on the reassuringly solid handle of my bushcraft knife. I saw nothing. I heard nothing beyond my own fire, but the feeling didn't leave. It felt like the forest itself was holding its breath, and I was the reason. Sleep came in fits and starts. I kept waking up with a jolt, my heart pounding, certain that something was standing just outside my tent. But there was never anything there. The next day, I found the first piece of tangible, undeniable evidence that something was deeply wrong. I was breaking camp when I noticed a set of tracks in the soft, damp earth near the stream, not 10 yards from where I had slept. They were humanoid. That was the first shock. I was days from any known trail. The chances of encountering another person out here were virtually zero. They were also barefoot, the prints clear and distinct in the mud. But it was the details of the tracks that turned my blood to ice. The stride was all wrong. The distance between the prints was enormous, longer than any human could naturally make, suggesting a creature of impossible height. The feet themselves were long and slender, but the real unsettling part was the gait. It was somehow uneven, as if the creature that made them had a strange, lurching walk. But the most disturbing detail, the one that made my rational mind stutter and fail, was where the tracks led. They came out of the dense woods on one side of the stream, crossed it, and then walked directly to a massive, sheer rock face, a solid wall of granite 20 feet high. And then they simply stopped. They didn't turn around. They didn't climb. There were no scuff marks on the rock, no other prints leading away. The trail just ended, as if whoever or whatever made them had walked straight into solid stone and vanished. I stood there for a long time, staring at the last footprint. I tried to rationalize it. I walked the area in a wide circle, looking for any other sign. Nothing. It was impossible. I took a photograph of the tracks and the rock face, knowing how insane it would look. A trail to nowhere. A seed of genuine fear, cold and hard, had been planted in my gut. The words on the map echoed in my mind, no longer a curiosity, but a chilling premonition. God forgive me. I packed up my gear with a new sense of urgency. My mission had changed. This was no longer about conquering a geographical challenge. It was about confirming a terror and then getting out. On the 10th day of my journey, I heard it. It started as a low vibration that I felt more in the soles of my boots than I heard with my ears. As I walked, it grew into a continuous, low-frequency murmur. It was completely different from the sound of any river I'd ever heard. It wasn't the cheerful babble of a mountain creek or the roaring, percussive cascade of a waterfall. It was a deep, guttural, monotonous drone. A sound that felt fundamentally wrong in its vibration, like an enormous machine humming deep within the earth. It was a sound that didn't belong in nature. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that it was the sound of the unwinding river. My heart was a steady, heavy drum against my ribs. I followed the sound, which grew louder and more disorienting with every step. The air grew colder, the light dimmer. I pushed my way through a final, dense thicket of shoulder-high ferns and sharp-thorned devil's club, the branches snagging at my clothes like desperate hands. And then I stepped out of the trees, and I stopped, breathless. I had found it. It was exactly as the map had promised, and 1,000 times more disturbing in reality. The unwinding river was not particularly large, perhaps 30 feet across, flowing through a channel of smooth, dark, polished stones. But the water was the color of slate, dark and completely opaque, like liquid shadow. And it was moving the wrong way. The valley floor sloped gently downwards, towards the west where I stood. By every law of nature, the river should have been flowing towards me. Instead, it flowed resolutely east uphill. There were no rapids, no churning white water, no sign of the immense force that would be required for such a feat. It moved with a smooth, viscous, unnatural slowness, like thick oil or cooling lava. It didn't splash or bubble against the rocks in its path. It seemed to climb over them, the dark water clinging to the stone for a moment before continuing its impossible, silent journey against gravity. The drone I'd been hearing was the sound of the water itself. A low, vibrating hum that seemed to resonate not just in my ears, but in my bones, in my teeth. It was the sound of a fundamental law being broken. I stood there on the bank for what felt like an hour, my mind struggling to process the sensory input. I tried to apply science to it, to force this impossible sight into a logical box. Is it a massive, undiscovered siphon system? Some bizarre geothermal or magnetic phenomenon? But the longer I watched, the more I felt, in my gut, that this wasn't science. This was something else. The place felt ancient and profoundly, primordially wrong. It felt like a scar on the face of the world, a place where the rules had been bent until they snapped, and they had never healed correctly. Slowly, cautiously, as if approaching a sleeping predator, I walked to the river's edge. The air grew noticeably colder the closer I got, a damp, cellar-like chill that clung to my skin. I knelt down. My logical mind, the scientist in me, compelled me to get a sample, to study it, to try and understand. I pulled a sterile collection vial from a side pocket of my pack. I leaned over the dark, silent water, my eyes transfixed by its slow, uphill crawl. The stones on the bank were covered in a slick, dark green moss. My boot, the one I had placed just a little too close to the edge, slipped. It wasn't a dramatic fall. I didn't tumble in head first. It was a clumsy, awkward slip, the kind you make 1,000 times on a trail. I threw out my hands to catch myself. My left hand landed hard on a rock, but my right arm, up to the elbow, and the entire right side of my face, cheek, my temple, my ear plunged into the river. The shock was instantaneous and violent, but it wasn't just the cold. The cold was brutal, yes. A deep, aching, penetrating chill that felt like it was flash freezing the very marrow in my bones. But it was overshadowed by another sensation. A sensation I still struggle to find words for. It was like a powerful jolt of static electricity, a nauseating wave of vertigo that made the world spin, and a sudden, deeply intimate and horrifying feeling of being scanned, copied. It felt as though a needle had been dropped onto the vinyl record of my consciousness, reading every groove, every nuance, every memory and feeling. There was a sickening sense of a part of me being peeled away, duplicated in a flawless, instantaneous act of psychic plagiarism. I yelled out, a sharp cry of shock and violation. I scrambled back from the bank, crab walking away from the water, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard it hurt. I wiped the dark, oily-feeling water from my face, my hand trembling uncontrollably. I looked at my palm. The water left no residue. It wasn't oily. It was just water. Cold, clear-looking water that behaved in an impossible way. I sat there on the damp earth, breathing heavily, trying to clear the dizzying sensation from my head. I told myself it was the shock. The extreme cold coupled with the sheer bizarreness of the place had triggered some kind of neurological misfire. It had to be. My mission was complete. The unwinding river was real. I had seen it, I had felt it, I had taken its temperature with my own flesh. The mystery was solved, even if the answer was simply, I don't understand. It was time to leave. It was past time. I packed my sample vial, which now felt like a radioactive isotope, in my bag. I forced myself to raise my camera and take a few photographs of the impossible river, my hands shaking so much I could barely hold it steady. Then I turned my back on the unwinding river and began the long hike out of that cursed, silent valley. I had no idea, not the slightest inkling, that I wasn't leaving alone. I thought I was escaping the anomaly. In truth, I was bringing it with me. I had no idea that the water had taken a souvenir, perfect copy, and that the most terrifying part of my journey, a journey into the depths of my own reflection, had only just begun. The hike back was marked by a new kind of silence, my own. After my encounter at the unwinding river, the slip, the chilling plunge of my arm and face into that unnatural water, the bizarre sensation of being mentally copied, me focus narrowed to a singular objective: escape. I was no longer an explorer savoring the wilderness. I was a refugee fleeing a scene of violation. My mind, usually so attuned to the subtleties of the forest, was a fortress of denial. I relentlessly pushed away the memory of that feeling. It was a neurological fluke, I told myself, a synesthetic reaction to extreme cold and psychological stress. My brain, confronted with an impossible realistic river flowing uphill, had simply short-circuited. It was the only explanation that allowed me to put one foot in front of the other. The oppressive, watchful feeling I'd had in the valley was gone. But it was replaced by something else, something far more insidious. A strange hollowness. A persistent, low-grade feeling of being out of sync. It was like watching a film where the audio is a few milliseconds behind the picture. The world around me felt sharp and real, but my own place within it felt delayed, disconnected. I'd reach for a branch to steady myself, and for a split second, my hand would feel like it belonged to someone else. I dismissed it as fatigue, the lingering shock echoing through my system. I hiked with a grim, mechanical determination, my boots eating up the miles. I didn't stop to photograph the way the light filtered through the canopy. I didn't pause to listen to the birdsong that had slowly returned as I put more distance between myself and that cursed valley. My only goal was the trailhead, my truck, the rumbling engine that would carry me back to a world governed by rules I understood. The first time I noticed something was truly, undeniably wrong was 2 days after leaving the river. I was exhausted, having pushed myself mercilessly. I made camp early, near a small, crystal-clear mountain spring that bubbled up from between moss-covered rocks. The water was pure, vibrant, everything the unwinding river was not. It was a symbol of the normalcy I was so desperate to return to. I knelt by the spring to refill my canteen. It was an old stainless steel bottle, dented and scratched from years of use, but polished to a dull sheen by my hands. As the cold, clear water trickled in, I glanced at my own reflection on its curved surface. The image was distorted, of course, warped by the cylindrical shape of the metal. My face was a caricature, long and thin. But that wasn't what made me freeze, my hand holding the canteen perfectly still. I knew I was utterly exhausted. My face in reality was etched with deep lines of fatigue. My eyes were bloodshot. My expression was a mask of grim tension. But the reflection on the canteen, it looked rested. Placid, even. The face warped in the steel was unervingly serene. And then, as I watched, holding my breath, the reflection's eyes seemed to drift slowly and calmly to the left, as if examining a flower just out of my line of sight, before gliding back to meet my gaze. The movement was smooth, languid, and entirely independent of my own fixed, horrified stare. I gasped, a sharp intake of air that broke the spell. I blinked hard. I shook my head, convinced it was a trick of the light, the shimmering movement of the water inside the canteen, the complex curves of the steel, and my own overtired mind. It had to be. I tilted the canteen, sloshing the water, and looked again. My reflection was me, tired, grim-faced, normal. The placid expression was gone. The eyes were my own, staring back with familiar weariness. I screwed the cap on tightly, my knuckles white. "Get a grip, Arthur," I muttered aloud, my voice sounding alien in the quiet woods. I told myself it was a microsleep, a waking dream. My brain was playing tricks on me. It was the only logical explanation, and I clung to it like a drowning man to a piece of driftwood. I continued my trek, forcing the incident from my mind, burying it under the physical exertion of the hike. I reached the trailhead on the 14th day of my expedition, a full week ahead of schedule. The sight of my truck, covered in a thick layer of dust and pine needles, was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. It was a monument to civilization, to physics, to a world that made sense. The drive back was a deliberate act of sensory immersion. I blasted music from the speakers, a chaotic storm of rock and roll that physically pushed the oppressive silence out of the car. I rolled down the windows, letting the wind whip my face, trying to scour the memory of that cold, dead air from my lungs. I stopped at the first Greasy Spoon diner I found and ordered the biggest, messiest burger on the menu, reveling in the noise, the smells, the mundane chatter of other people. I was running from the memory, trying to drown it in normalcy. I got back to my small, isolated cabin nestled in the foothills late that night. My sanctuary, my fortress of solitude, which had always been a place of comfort, not fear. I dropped my heavy pack in a heap on the floor with a sigh of profound relief. The journey was over. I was safe. All I wanted was a long, hot shower and a real bed. I stripped off my trail-worn clothes and walked into the bathroom. I flicked on the lights bright, fluorescent, unforgiving, and finally looked at my own face in the large, flat mirror above the sink. There I was, gaunt, bearded, sunburned. My eyes were webbed with red veins. My hair was matted. I looked every bit the man who had just spent 2 weeks wrestling with the wilderness and his own mind. A wave of relief washed over me. I had made it. It was over. I managed to smile, a genuine, exhausted, relieved smile. And my reflection did not. It just stared back at me. My smile was not returned. The face in the mirror remained utterly blank, neutral, its expression unchanging. The eyes, my eyes, were cold and dispassionate, like the glass lenses of a camera. They held my smiling gaze with a chilling stillness. The smile on my own face faltered, then died completely, replaced by a creeping dread that was colder and more terrifying than the river itself. I stood there, my face now frozen in a mask of shock, just watching. The face in the mirror was a perfect replica of mine. Every line, every pore, every sun-bleached hair in my beard was flawlessly rendered. But it was not me. The life behind the eyes, the spark of consciousness, was gone. Or rather, it had been replaced by a different consciousness. It was a perfect, empty copy, a vessel waiting to be filled. My heart began to hammer against my ribs, a frantic, trapped rhythm. This wasn't a curved surface. This wasn't a trick of the light. This was a flat, high-quality mirror in a brightly lit room. There were no excuses left. With a hand that trembled visibly, I raised my right arm, slowly, deliberately. The reflection raised its right hand in perfect, synchronous motion. I touched the side of my face, the same spot that had been submerged in the river. It did the same, its fingers mirroring mine exactly. Every movement was flawless. For a horrifying moment, I thought maybe I was crazy. Maybe this was all in my head. It's just my imagination, I whispered, my voice a dry, hoarse crackle. It has to be. I leaned closer, my breath fogging a small patch of the glass. I stared deep into those familiar, yet terrifyingly alien eyes, searching for a sign, for anything. And then it happened. Something small, something subtle, something so minor it would be meaningless in any other context. But in this one, it was a declaration of war. I blinked, an involuntary, reflexive action, and my reflection didn't. Its eyes remained wide open, staring at me for a full, eternal second after my own eyes had opened again. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion that was entirely its own, its eyelids slid shut and then opened again. It wasn't a blink. It was a conscious, calculated act. A message. I am not you. I am separate. A strangled cry escaped my throat. I stumbled backward, tripping over the bath mat, my limbs clumsy with terror. I crashed against the bathroom door, fumbled for the knob, and scrambled out into the hallway, slamming the door shut behind me. I leaned against the solid wood, my back pressed hard against it as if to keep the thing in the mirror from phasing through. I was hyperventilating, my lungs burning, my mind a screaming chaos. This wasn't fatigue. This wasn't a hallucination. This was real. The water, that damned water from the unwinding river. The water from the backward flowing river splashed on me. It had done something to me. No, not to me. To my reflection. It had severed the connection. It had given it a life of its own. The next few days, or was it weeks? Time lost all meaning, were a waking nightmare. My home, my sanctuary, became a prison. I developed a pathological fear of my own image. I took a thick towel and draped it over the bathroom mirror, securing it with duct tape. I avoided the large picture window in my living room after sunset, knowing it would transform into a black mirror reflecting the cabin's interior. I started drinking my morning coffee from an opaque ceramic mug, terrified of catching a glimpse of myself in the dark liquid. My own phone, its screen a sleek black portal when turned off, became an object of terror. I kept it face down at all times. But you can't escape your own reflection forever. It's a fundamental part of interacting with the world. It's everywhere. A rain puddle on the driveway, the chrome bumper of my truck, the polished silver of the toaster, a spoon gleaming on the countertop. Each time I accidentally caught a glimpse, it was there, watching, waiting, and its independence, its malevolence, grew with each passing day. One evening, my mind a frantic, sleep-deprived mess, I was trying to force myself to eat. I was chopping vegetables for a salad, the rhythmic thud of the knife on the cutting board the only sound. I glanced up, and my eyes inadvertently fell on the dark glass of the microwave door. My reflection was there, a tiny, distorted version of me standing in my kitchen. But while I was hunched over the counter, my brow furrowed in concentration, my reflection was standing perfectly still. Its head was tilted slightly to the side, as if it were listening intently to something I couldn't hear. Then, with a horrifyingly slow and deliberate motion, it raised its free hand and drew a single finger across its own throat. I dropped the knife, clattered loudly on the tile floor. I backed away, my eyes locked on the tiny, menacing figure in the microwave door. It held the pose for a moment longer, and then its expression shifted. It broke into a slow, cold, triumphant smile. It was a smile I had never made in my life. It was a predator's smile, full of pure, unadulterated malice. That was the moment the true nature of the horror crystallized. I wasn't just being haunted by a passive, glitching image. I was being stalked by a version of myself that hated me and wished me harm. Sleep became an impossibility. How could I close my eyes, knowing that it was out there, in the mirrors, watching? I would sit in the dark for hours, my cabin a minefield of reflective surfaces, all of them covered with blankets, towels, anything I could find. But even with the mirrors blinded, I could still feel it. A cold, static pressure in the air. The feeling of being watched, the one I'd felt in the valley, had returned. But now it was inside my own home. It was a constant, silent siege. I started talking to myself, my whispers echoing in the dark rooms. It's a part of you, I'd reason, my voice trembling. A complex trauma response. A dissociative hallucination brought on by stress. I tried to cling to psychology, to science, to any framework that would contain the madness. But I knew I was lying to myself. Hallucinations are products of your own mind. They don't have their own will. They don't threaten you with cold, calculated gestures. The entity in the mirror began to test its boundaries, growing bolder. It was no longer content to just mimic me imperfectly or make threatening gestures. It started to lag. I would turn my head to the left, and for a split second, the reflection in the toaster would remain looking straight ahead, its eyes locked on some distant point, before its head would snap to match my new position. The delay was tiny, a fraction of a second, but it was a terrifying demonstration of its separation from me. It wasn't bound by my movements anymore. It was choosing to follow them, and its compliance was becoming optional. The breaking point, the moment that pushed me from passive victim to active participant, came on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. I was sitting in my armchair, having not slept for what felt like 2 days, just staring at a blank wall, when I heard a soft tapping sound from down the hall. Tap, 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 tap. It was coming from the bathroom. My blood ran cold. I knew with absolute certainty that it was tapping on the other side of the covered mirror. Then, a new sound. On the polished stainless steel door of my refrigerator, I saw something that made my breath catch in my throat. The condensation from the humid air had formed a thin film on the metal. And in that film, a word had been traced, as if by an invisible finger. A single, possessive, terrifying word. Mine. It was a claim, a statement of intent. It wasn't just my reflection anymore. It was my replacement, and it was laying claim to my life, my home, my very existence. I stared at the word, my mind finally breaking free from the paralysis of fear and denial. Hiding was not a solution. Covering the mirrors was a fool's errand. This thing, this duplicate, this other Arthur wasn't going to be satisfied with tormenting me. It was growing stronger, more confident, more tangible with every passing hour. It was feeding on my fear, and I was starving it no longer. I knew then, with a terrible, clarifying certainty, that this would not end in my cabin. It wouldn't end with me hiding under blankets. Could only end where it began. I couldn't run from it. I couldn't hide from it. I had to confront it. There was only one place to go. One place this all started. I had to go back to the unwinding river. The decision to return was not born of courage. Let me be absolutely clear about that. Courage implies a choice, a weighing of options where you consciously choose the path of valor. I had no choice. I had no other options left. My life, once defined by the vast, open expanse of the wilderness, had shrunk to the four walls of my cabin. And even those walls had become a torture chamber. Every reflective surface was a hostile eye, a silent portal through which my personal demon observed me. The word it had written on my refrigerator and my naves, not just a threat. It was a declaration of ownership. I was no longer living in my home. I was haunting it. Hiding was a losing game, a slow-motion suicide. The entity I had started calling it the other in my head, to give it a name separate from my own, was growing stronger. I could feel it. The days of its subtle mockery were over. Its presence was now a palpable weight in the air, a constant, low-level hum of psychic energy that frayed my nerves and eroded my sanity. I wasn't just losing my mind. I felt like I was being slowly overwritten, my own consciousness being diluted and replaced by that cold, predatory thing from the mirror. So, the decision was not one of bravery. It was born of pure, distilled desperation. It was the desperate gambit of a cornered animal that has only two choices left: lie down and be consumed, or turn and face the predator, even if it means certain death. I chose to face it. Packing for the trip back was one of the most surreal and terrifying experiences of my life. The first time, my pack had been filled with tools of exploration and survival, each item a promise of adventure. This time, my bag was filled with instruments of torture, each one a potential doorway for it. I laid my gear out on the living room floor. My trusted bushcraft knife, its steel blade polished to a mirror shine. As I picked it up, I couldn't help but see a distorted reflection of my own face. For a horrifying second, I saw the reflection wink at me, a slow, conspiratorial gesture. I almost dropped it. I ended up wrapping the blade in thick leather, not to protect its edge, but to blind its surface. My compass, a tool that had saved my life more than once. Its glass cover was a perfect little mirror. I imagined looking down to find my way, only to see its eyes staring back up at me, directing me into a ravine. I packed it at the very bottom of my bag, wrapped in a sock. My camera, my beloved companion. Its lens was a complex, beautiful eye of curved glass. The thought of raising it to my face, only to see the other looking back at me from the other side of the lens, made my stomach clench. I left it behind. There would be no photographs this time. This was not a journey I wanted to remember. Even my satellite phone, my lifeline to the outside world, became an object of dread. Its dark, reflective screen was a black mirror I couldn't bear to look at. Before I left, there was one last thing I had to do. It was a test, a way to gauge the enemy. I walked down the hall and stood before the bathroom door, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The towel I had taped over the mirror was still in place. It looked pathetic, a flimsy ward against a supernatural foe. My hand trembled as I reached for the edge of the towel. I hesitated, my breath caught in my throat. Then, I pulled it away in one swift motion. And there it was, staring at me. The sight stole the air from my lungs. In the weeks of my self-imposed confinement, my physical form had deteriorated. I was thin, frighteningly so. My skin was pale and waxy, my eyes sunken and surrounded by dark, bruised-looking circles. I hadn't shaved, and my beard was a matted, unkempt mess. I was a picture of decay, a man actively falling apart. The other looked healthy. It looked strong. The gauntness was gone from its cheeks, replaced by a healthy fullness. Its eyes were clear and bright, radiating a terrifying vitality. The lines of stress and fear that were carved into my face were absent from it. It looked like the man I had been before all this began, but rested, confident, and imbued with a chilling new intensity. It was as if it was siphoning the life directly from me, thriving on my fear, growing more real as I faded. I stared at it, my fear warring with a rising tide of pure, unadulterated hatred. This thing was wearing my face, living in my reflection, and feasting on my life force. "What do you want?" I mouthed, not daring to give the question the power of sound. For the very first time, its expression shifted into something I recognized with a jolt of shock. It was a faint, ironic smirk. My smirk, the one I use when I figure out a difficult puzzle or a tricky route on a map. And then it spoke. No sound came from its mouth in the mirror. There was no vibration in the air. But the words bloomed inside my head, fully formed, in my own voice, but with an echo that was cold and metallic. "I want what is mine." The psychic impact of its voice was a physical blow. A wave of nausea and vertigo washed over me, so powerful that I had to grip the sides of the sink to keep from collapsing. My head throbbed as if a spike had been driven into it. It wasn't just in the mirror anymore. It was in my head. It had a direct line to my consciousness. The other simply watched my struggle, its smirk widening into a full, predatory grin. It seemed to relish my pain. Then, it slowly raised its hand and pointed, not at me, but at something past me, through the bathroom door. I didn't need to turn around to know where it was pointing. It was pointing east, towards the mountains, towards the river. It wasn't just a threat. It was an invitation, a challenge. It was confident that if I returned to its place of birth, it would win. The journey back into that cursed wilderness was a descent into a waking hell. Every step was fraught with a paranoia that was now completely justified. The wilderness itself felt different this time. It no longer felt indifferent, felt hostile, felt like its territory, and I was an intruder. The silence wasn't empty. It was charged, listening. The shadows in my peripheral vision seemed to writhe and coalesce into familiar shapes. Every reflective surface was an ambush. The still, glassy surface of a puddle after a rain shower forced me to make a wide 100-yard detour. One afternoon, I stopped to rest and a raven landed on a branch nearby, its head cocked, observing me with its shiny, black, intelligent eye. I looked at it, and for a gut-wrenching moment, I saw not the reflection of a tired hiker, but a flicker of cold, calculating intelligence looking back at me from within the bird's eye. I scrambled to my feet and hurried away, the raven's harsh caw chasing me through the trees. The other was toying with me, using the natural world as its personal hall of mirrors. On the third day of the hike, the true escalation began. I was scrambling up a steep, rocky incline, a treacherous slope of loose scree and sharp granite. My foot slipped. I fell hard, my pack absorbing most of the impact, but my metal water bottle came loose and skittered down the rocks, coming to rest in a small patch of moss about 20 feet below. I cursed my clumsiness and began to carefully climb down to retrieve it. As I got closer, my eyes were drawn to my reflection on its dented, but still polished surface. I was on my hands and knees, my face contorted with effort as I carefully navigated the loose rocks. My reflection was standing upright. I froze, my hand hovering over a rock. The tiny figure on the canteen was standing casually, its arms crossed, watching my pathetic, painstaking descent. It was no longer bound to the same laws of physics that governed me. In its reflected world, it could defy gravity. It looked down at me, the real, struggling Arthur, with an expression of faint, detached amusement, like a man watching an ant struggle to carry a breadcrumb. "You're so slow," the voice in my head echoed. It was no longer just a whisper. It was clearer now, laced with a smug, condescending amusement. So fragile, so bound by the flesh. My blood ran cold. This changed everything. It wasn't just a copy anymore. It was evolving. It was becoming something superior, something that viewed my physical limitations with contempt. I grabbed the canteen, my hand shaking with rage and fear, and shoved it deep into the bottom of my pack, refusing to look at it again. The final day of the approach to the river was the worst. The low, guttural drone of the water began, a sound I now associated with pure violation. And with the drone, the pressure in my mind intensified. The other's voice was no longer a mocking whisper at the edge of my thoughts. It was a constant companion, a taunting narrator for my personal hell. "Almost home, Arthur. You're bringing me home. I have to thank you for that. I couldn't have made the journey myself." The thought was paralyzing. Was I its puppet? Was this entire return trip its idea, implanted in my mind? Was I simply a vehicle, a flesh-and-bone taxi service for my own destroyer? Don't fight it. It's our destiny, to be whole again. The better part of us, anyway. I finally broke through the tree line, my clothes torn, my body screaming with exhaustion, my mind a battlefield. I stood once more on the bank of the unwinding river. It was exactly as I remembered it. Dark, silent but for its soul-deep hum, and moving with that same impossible viscous slowness against the grade. The air was frigid, carrying the scent of wet stone and something else, something metallic and ancient. But this time, there was one profound, terrifying difference. I looked down at my reflection in the dark, slate-like water, and it wasn't there. For a single glorious second, my heart soared with a desperate hope. Was it gone? Had the journey back, the return to the source, somehow broken the curse? Then I raised my eyes, and I saw it. It wasn't at my feet. It was standing on the opposite bank. It wasn't a reflection anymore. It was a solid, three-dimensional, physical being. A perfect, living, breathing replica of me, standing 30 feet away, separated only by the unnatural current of the river. It was dressed in my clothes, carrying a phantom version of my pack. But where I was slumped, exhausted, and terrified, it stood tall, straight-backed and confident. It looked like the adventurer I used to be before all of this. I looked like a ghost. You came back, it said. And this time its voice was not just in my head. It was real. It echoed across the water. My own voice, but clearer, stronger, more resonant. The sound vibrated in the cold air. "This has to end," I said, and my own voice came out as a weak, trembling whisper that the river seemed to swallow. "I won't be your prisoner." The other laughed, a real audible laugh. It was my laugh, but stripped of all warmth and humor, leaving only a hollow, cruel sound. "Prisoner? Oh no, Arthur. You still don't understand. You have it all wrong. You're not the prisoner. You were never the prisoner. You're the cocoon, the shed skin. I am what crawled out." It took a purposeful step closer to the river's edge on its side. What are you?" I demanded, my hand instinctively gripping the handle of my sheathed knife. A completely useless gesture. "I am the potential," it said, its voice seeming to harmonize with the drone of the river. "I am the version of you that isn't held back by fear, or doubt, or guilt, or morality. This place, this river, it doesn't just flow backward. It unwinds. It unwinds reality. It unwinds possibilities. When your flesh touched it, it saw you. All of you. Your past, your future, your weaknesses. And it saw a better version. A stronger possibility. Me. I stared at the thing wearing my face. The thing that had tormented me, driven me to the brink of insanity. And it was explaining its own genesis with a terrifying, calm, and unshakable logic. "The reflection is the real object," it continued, its voice hypnotic, compelling. "The object is just the shadow that casts it. You've been living in the shadow world your entire life, Arthur. Flawed, afraid, temporary. I am the permanent image. It's time for you to fade." It gestured with one hand at the dark, flowing water. "What do you want me to do?" I asked, a bitter, hopeless laugh escaping my own lips. "Want me to jump in? Finish the job for you?" The river created a paradox, it said, its expression turning serious, almost academic. Two iterations of the same being. "The universe doesn't like paradoxes, Arthur. They are messy, unstable. They must be resolved. One of us is the original, the core pattern. The other is the copy, the echo. And to restore balance, the copy must be erased." It smiled that terrible, malicious smile again, the one I had seen in the microwave door. It was a smile of absolute certainty. "The problem for you is which one of us do you think the universe and the river will favor? The broken, terrified wreck standing in the mud, or the perfected form standing here before you?" It then did something that shattered the last of my resolve and plunged me into the abyss. It turned its head and looked down the river, to the east against the current. "I can see it, you know," it said softly, almost dreamily. "The possibilities this river offers. The other laws we can break. The power we could have. We just have to get rid of the baggage." It turned its gaze back to me, its eyes seeming to glow with a faint, internal luminescence in the dim light. "You're the baggage, Arthur." And then it stepped off the stone bank, and it began to walk across the water. It didn't sink. Its boots touched the dark, slate surface of the unwinding river as if it were solid ground. It walked towards me, its steps slow, deliberate, and utterly, profanely impossible. With each step it took, a crushing psychic pressure slammed into my mind, a palpable force trying to extinguish my consciousness, to unmake my very soul. It wasn't trying to kill my body. It was trying to erase me from existence. I was paralyzed, frozen to the spot by a terror so pure and absolute it transcended all other thought. This was it, the end. The monster was crossing its impossible bridge to claim my life, my world, my very existence. and I was too afraid to even move. Time didn't just slow down. It fractured. It stretched and warped around the impossible figure walking towards me. Each step it took upon the dark water sent ripples not through the river, but through my sanity. The drone of the water, the crushing weight in my mind, the sight of my own face worn by a monster, it all coalesced into a single perfect moment of absolute terror. It was 10 feet away, now 8, now 6, a profane messiah walking on unholy water to claim his prize. And I was the prize. Its eyes, my eyes, were locked on mine, and in their depths, I saw nothing but a cold, predatory hunger. It was the look of a wolf that has finally cornered a bleeding deer. There was no rage in its expression, no anger, just a calm, chilling certainty of the outcome. My mind was a screaming cacophony of primal commands. Run, fight, breathe, do something. But my body was no longer mine to command. It was locked in place, a statue of fear, anchored to the muddy bank by a terror so pure and absolute it bypassed reason. This was not a bear or a blizzard, physical threats I could comprehend and fight. This was a metaphysical predator. This was a walking paradox come to correct itself by erasing me. How do you fight a concept? How do you punch a ghost? As it drew closer, its voice slithered into my mind again. But its tone had changed. It was no longer mocking or superior. It was soft now, gentle, seductive. It was the most dangerous it had ever been. It's so easy, Arthur. The voice whispered, a velvet caress inside my skull. Just let go. You're so tired. You've fought so hard. Stop fighting. It won't hurt. There will be no pain. It will just end. You can rest. Finally, you can have the silence you always craved. A true, final silence. And God help me, a part of me listened. A treacherous, exhausted part of my soul responded to that siren song of oblivion. I was tired. I was worn down to the nub, scraped raw by weeks of fear and paranoia. The idea of just stopping, of letting the curtain fall, of letting the oppressive weight of consciousness simply lift it felt like a mercy. For a fleeting second, I considered it. I actually considered surrendering my own soul just to make the terror stop. The other was only a few feet away now. So close I could see the tiny, frantic pulse in its neck. So close I could smell the cold, damp scent of the river clinging to it. It raised a hand, palm open, not in a threatening gesture, but in an invitation, a welcome home. Join me, it whispered, its voice resonating with a deep, final power. Or rather, rejoin me. We will be whole again. Let the stronger part live. And that's when it happened. In the deepest, most terrified corner of my mind, where the last embers of my identity were fighting not to be extinguished, a different thought arose. It wasn't a product of courage. It was a product of pure, stubborn logic. A tiny, defiant spark of pedantic reasoning in the face of overwhelming madness. The question formed, clear and sharp as a shard of ice. If you are the perfected version, the stronger part, why do you need me to give up? The other's serene, welcoming expression faltered. Just for a fraction of a second. A barely perceptible flicker of annoyance? The psychic pressure in my mind eased. Just a fraction. It was enough. If you are the real one, my own thoughts continued, gaining strength, feeding on that flicker of weakness. Why couldn't you just replace me back at the cabin? Why did you have to torment me? Why play all these games? The other stopped walking. It stood just an arm's length away, its feet resting on the dark surface of the water. Its expression was no longer confident. It was laced with a flash of cold irritation. The mask was slipping. You're twisting the logic. It hissed in my mind. The seductive tone gone, replaced by a sharp, defensive anger. The copy must be erased. That is the rule of this place. One must yield. And you're the copy? I whispered, the words tasting of salt and defiance on my tongue. It was a bluff, a desperate, insane gamble against a soul-eating doppelganger. But it was the only card I had left to play. You were born from my reflection. You are the shadow. You have no substance of your own. A new thought bloomed, a sudden, blinding epiphany. The way it had looked healthier as I grew weaker. The way it had to resort to psychological terror instead of direct action. You need my fear, I said, my voice gaining a tremor of strength. It's what you feed on. It's what gives you substance. Without me being afraid of you, you're just an image. A photograph. You're wrong. It screamed in my head. The psychic force slammed into me like a physical blow. I staggered back a step, my boots sinking into the soft mud. But this time, the blow wasn't just pain. It was confirmation. Its anger was the anger of a liar being exposed. And my own anger was becoming a shield. My identity, the true core of who I was, began to rally. It wasn't just Arthur the adventurer. It was Arthur the son, Arthur the friend, Arthur the man who loved the smell of old books and the taste of black coffee. The man who had failed, who had grieved, who had loved. The messy, complicated, flawed, and real sum of my experiences. I summoned them all. The memory of the rough texture of my father's flannel shirt when he hugged me. The specific scent of my mother's kitchen on a Sunday morning. The burn of cheap whiskey on a cold night. The sting of a failure and the quiet pride of an accomplishment. These weren't just memories. They were my foundation. They were the things it could know but could never ever feel. You have my face, I said, my voice growing stronger, louder, pushing back against the drone of the river. You have my memories, but you don't have my scars. You don't have my soul. You are an echo in a canyon, and you think you're the voice. I took a deep breath. And I am done listening to you. I am the perfected you, the one without weakness. It shrieked, and for the first time, its physical voice, a distorted, raging version of my own, echoed across the water, filled with a desperate, cracking fury. Weakness. I shot back, a raw, incredulous laugh bubbling up from my chest. Our weaknesses are what make us who we are. They're the spaces where we learn, where we grow. You're not me without weakness. You're just less of me. A cheap, hollowed-out imitation. I looked it dead in the eyes. The fear was still there. A cold knot in my stomach, but it was no longer in control. My hatred for it, my love for my own flawed life was stronger. And then I made the most counterintuitive, the most insane, the most powerful decision of my life. I turned my back on it. I deliberately, and with immense effort of will, broke eye contact and turned my body away from the river, away from the monster that wore my face. The psychic scream of pure, unadulterated rage and panic that erupted in my mind was the most horrific sound I have ever experienced. It was a silent, high-frequency shriek of a being seeing its own demise. Look at me. You cannot ignore me. I am you. Look at me. I squeezed my eyes shut, planting my feet firmly in the mud. I refused. I denied it my attention. I denied it my focus. I denied it my fear. I blocked out its psychic screams and instead, I focused on the feeling of the cold air on my skin, the mud under my boots, the memory of sunlight. I focused on everything that was real, everything that was mine. You are nothing, I said, my voice low and steady, my back still to the river. You are a bad dream, a glitch in the system, and I am waking up now. I felt a frigid wind whip around me, tearing at my clothes. The drone of the river intensified to a painful, deafening shriek. The voice in my head was a torrent of curses, pleas, and threats. But underneath the storm of its rage, I could feel its power waning. It was like a broadcaster losing its signal. Its panic was no longer a weapon. It was a symptom of its own dissolution. It was starving. I took one step away from the river. "Arthur, please." The voice was thin now, weak, desperate. The shriek had become a pathetic whine. Slowly, summoning every last ounce of my courage, I chanced to look over my shoulder. The sight was both horrifying and vindicating. The other was no longer solid. Its form was flickering violently, like a bad holographic projection. It was becoming transparent, the dark water of the river and the trees on the far bank visible through its wavering form. The confident, powerful being was gone, replaced by a terrified, translucent specter. Its face was a mask of pure terror, its mouth open in a desperate, soundless plea. It was reaching for me, but its hand was like smoke, unable to grasp anything. Reality itself was rejecting its flawed existence. It had no power without my focus. It had no substance without my fear. It was nothing but a parasite, and its host was finally fighting back. I turned fully to face it, my fear now completely gone, replaced by a cold, hard, pitying resolve. I looked it dead in its flickering, terrified eyes. "You are not me," I said, and my voice rang with the absolute finality of a judge's gavel. Its form flickered one last time, violently. Its mouth opened in a silent, agonizing scream as the fundamental laws of nature reasserted themselves. Then, like smoke in a gale, it was shredded and torn apart, not by a physical force, but by the reinstatement of the rule it had violated. It didn't explode. It didn't fade away. It was unmade. It simply, utterly ceased to exist. The moment it was gone, the world changed. The oppressive, soul-deep drone of the river stopped. Instantly, the silence it left behind was absolute, but only for a second. Then, it was filled by the natural sounds of the forest I had forgotten existed. A bird chirped, loud and clear, somewhere nearby. The wind, now just a gentle breeze, rustled the leaves in the trees above me. The oppressive, cold, malevolent pressure in my mind, the weight I had been carrying for weeks, vanished. It was like a 1,000-pound pack had been lifted from my soul, leaving behind a profound, aching, beautiful emptiness. I stood there, gasping, my body trembling with the aftershocks of the ordeal. Sweat and tears ran down my face, mingling with the dirt. I was alive. I was alone. I cautiously approached the river's edge. I looked down into the dark, slate-like water, and I saw myself, just me, a tired, haggard, mud-stained man staring back. My reflection was perfect. It was me. When I blinked, it blinked. When I moved, it moved. There was no lag. There was no malice. There was only my own face. I didn't linger. I turned and walked away from the unwinding river for the last and final time. I didn't run. I walked with the steady, measured pace of a man who had faced his own ghost in the heart of its power and had won. The long hike out of the wilderness was a journey back to life. With every step away from that valley, I felt my own identity, my own soul reasserting itself, flowing back into the hollow spaces the other had carved out. The world seemed brighter. The air felt cleaner. When I finally, blessedly, got back to my cabin, exhausted beyond measure but whole, the first thing I did was walk into the bathroom. I stood before the mirror, my heart calm and steady, and I saw myself, just me, tired, scarred, but alive, and blessedly, beautifully, completely alone. I managed a small, weary, triumphant smile, and in the mirror my reflection smiled back. I never went back, of course. That should be obvious. Some doors, once you find the courage to close them, must be sealed forever. Some places on the map should remain blank. After it was over, after the thing that wore my face was unmade by the fundamental laws it sought to defy, I stood on that riverbank for a long time. The silence was deafening in its normalcy. The drone was gone, and its absence was a hollow space in the world, a space that was slowly, blessedly, being filled by the gentle, chaotic symphony of life. The chirp of a winter wren, the sigh of the wind through the ancient firs, the distant gurgle of a normal stream, flowing downhill, the way God and gravity intended. The walk back was not a journey of escape. The first time I had fled, a panicked animal escaping a trap. This time it was a pilgrimage, a slow, deliberate reclamation of myself and my place in the world. Every step was a confirmation. I am real. This ground is real. My breath is real. The forest no longer felt like enemy territory. It was just a forest again, vast, indifferent, and beautiful in its complexity. The light filtering through the canopy seemed warmer. The air felt cleaner, as if the world itself had been holding its breath with me and had finally let out a collective sigh of relief. When I finally reached my truck, it looked less like a machine and more like a chariot waiting to carry me back from the land of the dead. The drive home was quiet. I didn't need to blast music to drown out the silence this time. I welcomed it. It was my old friend again. The peaceful solitude I had always sought now returned to me, its meaning forever changed, deepened by the crucible I had endured. Arriving at my cabin was the final test. This place, my former sanctuary turned prison, held the last of the ghosts. I walked through the door and the air felt still, empty. The oppressive weight was gone. The feeling of being watched had vanished. I was truly, finally alone. But I knew there was one last thing I had to do, one last demon to face. With my heart beating a slow, steady rhythm, I walked down the hallway to the bathroom. I didn't hesitate. I pushed the door open and stood before the mirror, the same mirror where the nightmare had truly begun. And I looked. My own face stared back. Gaunt, yes, scarred and sunburned. My eyes were haunted, holding a new depth that would never leave. But they were my eyes. Behind them was my consciousness, my history, my soul. There was no coldness, no alien intelligence. Just a man who had been to the edge of his own existence and had, somehow, found his way back. I raised my right hand, the same hand that had plunged into that cursed water. The reflection raised its hand in perfect, instantaneous synchrony. I touched my cheek, touched its cheek. I took a deep, shuddering breath. It did the same. And then, I did the one thing I had been too terrified to do for weeks. I smiled. A small, weary, broken, but genuine smile. And in the mirror, my reflection smiled back. A tear I hadn't realized I was holding traced a path through the grime on my cheek. The reflection cried with me. The connection was restored. The loop was closed. I was whole. That night, I built a large fire in the pit outside my cabin. I went to my study and took down the old, brittle map from 1888. I held it in my hands for a long time, tracing the faint blue line of the unwinding river and the spidery, desperate handwriting. God forgive me. I finally understood what that surveyor had felt. He hadn't just seen a geological anomaly. He had seen a place where reality was thin, a place that could unravel a man. He had felt its wrongness, and it had terrified him enough to plead for his soul on paper. I carefully folded the map, and I laid it in the heart of the fire. I watched as the flames licked at the old paper, curling the edges, turning the forgotten valleys and peaks to black ash. The name Unwinding River glowed orange for a moment, and then it was gone, consumed. Then I retrieved the sample vial. I had carried it all the way back, a tiny vial of dark, ordinary-looking water. It felt heavy in my hand, heavy with potential, heavy with the horror it had unleashed. I uncapped it, and I poured it onto the thirsty ground, far from any water source. The earth drank it in a second, and it was gone. I then threw the vial into the fire, and watched until the plastic melted into an unrecognizable lump. I was erasing the path. I was ensuring no one, including a weaker version of myself in the future, could ever find that place again. So, the story ends there, you might think. I faced the monster, I won, and life went back to normal. But it's not that simple. Life never goes back to normal after something like that. It goes on to a new normal. I still go out into the wilderness. I have to. It's a part of who I am. But I've changed. A part of me will forever be standing on that riverbank, facing down the thing that wore my face. The silence I find in the woods is still beautiful, but I listen to it more carefully now. I pay attention to its quality. There is a difference between peaceful silence and a silence that is holding its breath. I know that difference now in my bones. And reflections, I have a new relationship with reflections. The terror is gone, but a deep-seated wariness remains. It's an instinct now, a permanent scar on my psyche. I can look in a mirror without panic. But sometimes, late at night, if I catch my reflection unexpectedly in a dark window or the black screen of a powered-off television, my heart will still skip a beat. There is a flash of cold dread, a momentary, terrifying flicker of a question. Is it really me? It always is. But the fact that I have to ask, that's the price I paid. Sometimes I'll be washing my hands and I'll just stare at my reflection in the water swirling down the drain, and for a second, I'll feel a phantom vertigo, a memory of that sickening feeling of being copied. I've learned to live with these echoes. They are reminders. They keep me vigilant. I've spent countless sleepless nights pondering the fundamental question. What was it? What did I face on that riverbank? I don't have a definitive answer. I don't think I ever will. The human mind craves categorization, but some things defy our neat little boxes. Was it a genius loci? A spirit of the place? An ancient, elemental consciousness tied to that specific, unnatural feature of the landscape? Many ancient cultures believed that places, especially strange ones, had their own sentience. Maybe the river, in its wrongness, had developed a spirit that was equally wrong, a spirit that envied the wholeness and reality of the living beings that stumbled upon it. Or was it a psychic projection? A tulpa? A thought form? Did the river act as some kind of psychic amplifier, taking the seeds of doubt, fear, and potential that exist in every human mind and giving them objective form? Did I, in fact, create my own monster? Was the other a manifestation of all my own worst traits, me arrogance, my self-doubt, my inner darkness given life and substance by that strange water and my own terror? That is, in many ways, the most terrifying possibility. Or was it something else entirely, something more akin to science fiction than folklore? A rift, a place where the membrane between our reality and another, one with different laws, had worn thin. And when I touched the water, I essentially dipped my hand into that other reality, creating a quantum entanglement, a paradox that the universe itself then sought to resolve in the simplest way possible, by eliminating one of the duplicates. I don't know. Maybe it was all three. Maybe it was something my vocabulary, and indeed human language, is not equipped to describe. All I know for certain is that it was real. It was intelligent. And it wanted to replace me. And that brings me to the purpose of this story. The reason I am sharing this deeply personal and traumatic account on this channel. It's to establish a protocol. A wilderness protocol for an encounter that goes beyond the known dangers of exposure, predators, or getting lost. So here it is. First, trust your instincts above all else. above your map, above your compass, above your own logical disbelief. If you enter a place and the world feels fundamentally wrong, if the silence is too loud, if the animals are gone, if the air feels dead, oh, not try to rationalize it. Your oldest, most primal senses are warning you. Listen to them. Second, acknowledge the sign. I found tracks that led to a solid rock wall and I explained them away. I felt a presence and I dismissed it as fatigue. I was arrogant. I believed my modern, rational mind was superior to the evidence of my senses. Do not make my mistake. If the wilderness shows you something that is impossible, don't try to fit it into your worldview. Accept that your worldview may be too small and retreat. Third, some places are not meant for us. We have this modern notion that the entire world is ours to explore, to chart, to conquer. It is not. There are corners of this world that are older and stranger than we can imagine. Places where the rules are different. Finding such a place does not make you an explorer. It makes you a trespasser. Leave. Do not take souvenirs. Do not take photographs. Do not take samples. Leave nothing, and more importantly, take nothing with you. And finally, if the worst should happen, if you ignore the warnings and you are confronted by something that seeks to unmake you, know this. Its greatest weapon is your own fear. Your own identity, your history, your flaws, your loves, your pain. That is not your baggage. That is not your weakness. That is your shield and your sword. That is the core of your reality. Cling to it. It is the only thing that a shadow cannot steal. I am a different man now. I carry a new kind of quiet within me. It's the quiet of a man who has looked his own non-existence in the face and chosen to exist. It's a quiet gratitude. Every sunrise, every cup of coffee, every normal, boring reflection of myself in a shop window is a small, profound miracle. I have learned that the greatest wilderness is not in the trackless mountains or the deep forests. It is the vast, uncharted territory behind your own eyes. And you must be vigilant about who or what you allow to live there. Thank you for listening to my story. I know it's a difficult one to believe, and that's okay. I'm not asking for belief, only for consideration. I needed to tell it, to put it out into the world not as a boast, but as a buoy, a warning marker for other explorers navigating the deep waters. If you've had your own unexplained encounters in the wilderness, your own encounters with places where nature felt wrong, I invite you to share them in the comments below. These stories need to be told. The protocols need to be shared. We are, in these matters, alone together. If you found this account valuable, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the Wilderness Protocol. There are more stories to tell, more warnings to share. Stay vigilant. And remember, sometimes the deepest wilderness is the one you carry inside you.